May I now invite His Excellency Ambassador Abdurrahman Salahuddin, the Assistant Foreign Minister for Arab and Middle Eastern Affairs, to the podium to deliver his statement.
Good morning. Ms. Anita Nairudi, UN Resident Coordinator, Excellencies, Head of Missions and Chargé d'Affaires, UN agencies representatives, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome all of you to the Egyptian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and would like to thank you for joining us today for the launching of the Egypt chapter of the 3RP 2015-2016 in Cairo, in cooperation with the United Nations. Let me first thank every host country for the help and assistance it is providing to our Syrian brothers and sisters who were compelled to suffer from the atrocities of the war in their country. Let me also thank every single relief worker, organization, and agency working in Syria or with the Syrian refugees, and thank the donor countries, especially those who are represented here today by their distinguished ambassadors and representatives. I am also grateful to Ms. Anita Nairudi, UN Resident Coordinator and UNDP Resident Representative in Egypt, and the very dedicated UN team in Egypt for their hard work and cooperation with our government to assist Syrian refugees and develop our ability to continue to do so. Ladies and gentlemen, more than 6.5 million internally displaced persons, almost 3.1 million refugees, a death toll that is reaching more than 200,000 casualties. Actually, today it is closer to 220,000 casualties, and much more wounded. This is some of the impact of the protracted, cruel Syrian war. Unfortunately, this suffering will continue for some time to come as long as there is no political solution reached and military operations dominate the Syrian scene. Since the onset of the Syrian revolution in March 2011, and for more than 3 years, countries of the region have been witnessing a massive flow of refugees who were forced to leave their homes. More than 300,000 people found their way to Egypt. Despite the fact that Egypt does not have common borders with Syria, increasing refugees influx is expected in light of the protracted crisis in Syria and the Egyptian government policy that allows for family reunification and does not permit any forcible return to Syria. UN Security Council resolutions 2139 and 2165 have referred to Egypt among the top 5 host countries for Syrian refugees, along with Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, and Iraq. Unlike the case in most countries hosting a sudden flow of refugees fleeing from armed conflicts, we have no refugee camps, and Syrian refugees in Egypt are living within the host communities and have been integrated within this neighborhood. As an example of our preliminary effort of assessment, and based on the minimum estimation of numbers of Syrian refugees in Egypt, we found out that the financial burden of the Syrian refugees' share in one item of the Egyptian budget in 2014-2015, which is food and energy subsidies alone, would reach almost 1 billion Egyptian pounds, or almost $140 million. A detailed configuration of all the other costs associated with hosting the Syrian refugees will be presented later by my colleague, Ambassador Abulkir. Took a decision since the beginning of the refugees crisis to provide our Syrian brothers full and free access to the same public services rendered to Egyptians. The same health care, education, and higher education, which are massively subsidized, are often provided virtually free of charge. Consequently, among the host countries in the region, Egypt has the highest enrollment rates of the Syrian refugees' children, with 39,314 school students and 14,085 university students registered this year. Ladies and gentlemen, Egypt welcomes and supports the new 3RP dual-track approach, which is considered to be the first that emphasizes both the development of the host community's capacity building and dealing with the humanitarian dimension of the crisis on equal footing. We hope that this approach would help host communities and governments meet the existing burdens and the future requirements needed to maintain sustainable support for the Syrian refugees. Further, it presents the donors community with minimum funding levels required to maintain the present size and quality of assistance and services provided to the Syrian refugees. Donors' fatigue resulted from their contributions to several humanitarian crises around the globe and in the Middle East, unfortunately, have made even our problems worse. However, shortfalls in funding of the concerned international agencies and programs remains a challenge that needs to be shouldered. More than 50% and sometimes 60 and 70% of host countries' requirements are not met. And yet, some humanitarian agencies' funds are being reduced. Recognizing this fact, the host communities expect the donor community would increase their generous contribution not only to meet the real and basic needs of the Syrian refugees, but also to contribute to the resilience components related to the development of host communities. We also call upon all developed countries capable of resettling Syrian refugees on their territories to do so. I look forward to seeing every donor participating in the upcoming Third Donors Conference to be hosted by Kuwait on March 31st in 2015. And I hope that they will be generously contributing to alleviate the pain on the Syrian people and pledging to fully meet the required funding for host countries. In order to sustain assistance to Syrian refugees, and in particular the younger generation, we should work towards supporting the efforts, protecting the children, and guaranteeing that there is no lost generation among those refugees. Ladies,
organizations like the ICRC are providing the non-food assistance in terms of cash assistance. Thank you.
Actually, we made an exception in this case because you know that UNRWA does not have a mandate in Egypt. So actually we made an exception. The government of Egypt made an exception in this case in order to accommodate this very special situation. As far as those who would enter Egypt in an illegal way, and you know a lot of trafficking is happening right now via Turkey, as long as they are able to prove their citizenship as Syrians or Palestinians for that matter, they are provided the chance of either apply for a family reunification if they have family members here in Egypt, and our Egyptian laws allow for that, or find a third country. And this is a good opportunity to address actually some of your member countries, European Union member countries, for who are generous enough to host some of those refugees for a relocation. And I think this could be a very useful program in cooperation with the UNHCR and other UN organizations. And it's a good opportunity for me again to appeal once again to all developed countries to shoulder with us this problem. We in Egypt, and we are not a bordering country with Syria, we've hosted voluntarily 300,000 refugees. I hope that similar numbers can find their ways to some of the very well developed and much more economically advanced and wealthy to afford such generosity. So we are not only talking about generous contribution, but we are talking about also generously hosting some of those refugees, especially those that we have problems with their legal status. I think we should be able to work out some mechanism with UNHCR where we can, whenever we can substantiate their documentation, is to let them move to a third country. Thank you.
Next question, please. Please, Ms. Anita Naidu, you have the floor.
Just if in case there are no additional questions, perhaps I could give the opportunity very briefly to any of the sector leads if you would like to say something. I know you've been distributing documentation, but on health, education, food, livelihoods, if you are interested to make any inputs at this time, please go ahead.
شيء لو ممثلي وزارتنا اللي موجودين في الصالة عاوزين يضيفوا أي شيء للتقديم اللي تم تقديمه بواسطة وزارة الخارجية يسعدنا إن احنا نسمعهم طبعا. I'm inviting also our governmental agencies representative who are in the room if they would like to add anything to the presentation that we just given.
We'll take 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Okay. I'm Lubna Alaman, representative of the World Food Programme, for those who don't know me. I think very briefly, the presentation had touched on the 3 RP and the needs and requirements of the food security sector. And I'm also here to kind of very briefly say that I would like to thank the donors for their generosity. I mean, so far for this component of food assistance in Egypt, we have received 44 million US dollars in, more than 58 million that we have been using over this time. However, as you know, the funding shortfalls and maybe some donor fatigue has also started to show very much as a whole region, not only Egypt in particular, but of course it has affected us here. And in order to do that, we have had to kind of cut back. We were assisting by the end of 2014 100,000 refugees, of which 4,000 were the Palestinian second-time refugees from Yarmouk camp, mostly, that we just spoke about. This year, with the assessments that we aim to do, we really need to even target the most vulnerable of those remaining. And we are, trying to see how we can reach maybe only 80,000. So that is also a cut in the number of the refugees who will receive assistance. Elizabeth already mentioned that we had to cut back the ration value. When we cut it back last September to $24, it was still to ensure that the complete food basket of more than 25 commodities was given at $24. But now, from the beginning of this year, because of the lack of funding, we had to reduce everything by 30%, which meant that the actual individual is receiving $17. This is more than around 50% cut from the 28 that they were receiving. So we really, this is one of the key messages that we have, that we cannot reduce that further. I mean, this is even less than the minimum requirements required for those refugees. So we really count on that. And the funding shortfall really has affected us even in the coming few months, where we need urgently some $6 million. Now, most of our money goes directly into the food assistance. We do not have a lot of extra charges or NGO implementing partners, since we are mostly contracting directly the supermarkets. So it is, most of that money is going into the economy and in the hands of the refugees. Thank you very much.